Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we're going to be talking about cutting and thrusting angles, which will also include a technique that I'm experimenting with and I've had some success with and might give you all some opportunities and ideas as well. So I'll talk about the general concept first before getting into the exact technique. So of course it goes without saying that there are different ways in which you can and cannot thrust. So if I have something like this shield in my hand and someone thrust from their middle towards my chest and the shield's in the way, it stopped. If it's out of the way, it works. And stuff like, of course, how to get around a shield. Someone could do something like go over or under or around the shield. But there can also be more interesting ways in which this sort of thing can play out. And this will factor a lot into, of course, the handiwork of the sword, but also factors like footwork. Bearing in mind, unlike in sport fencing, where I think they have a lot more linear footwork, and how in certain styles that we look at, such as British military sabre, although it's not explicitly enforced, the footwork can sometimes end up feeling more linear, where you're just going towards your opponent or away from your opponent. Whereas if it's some sort of one-on-one duel or some sort of self-defense situation, or even in historical battles where there were opportunities for small skirmishes where people actually had a bit more freedom of movement, you wouldn't necessarily just have the option to go forwards towards someone or backwards away from someone. And just simply adjusting where your position is can change the new targets that you've got and also remove some of the old ones in differing ways. It's always worth bearing in mind. So, when we're looking at the angles of which you can attack, of course there are a few factors we need to bear in mind. Firstly, your opponent's positioning. So, if your opponent, of course, if they're closer or further away, certain targets come in and out. They might start, perhaps if they've got something extended, they might have something like their arm exposed, then close in maybe shoulders, head, and torso and all of those sorts of things. But also, where an opponent is starting in different positions, or perhaps they're executing cuts, thrusts, and attempted defences, you'll notice factors like their footwork changing. So one of the best ways in which you can try to cut, for example, at the legs, is actually after an opponent has attacked. So if someone is starting, say around here, usually when an opponent is more relaxed, if someone is kind of just, then gauging distance, like if we were me and the camera's distance away now, can't really do anything to hit each other, so we're just more relaxed, we're kind of, gauging, maybe trying a few feints, gesturing, posturing, changing stances, doing whatever, getting ready to see how the person reacts, and all of this sort of stuff, which you sometimes even see in movies and TV representing this, but usually they don't put as much emphasis on that because, well, it looks quite boring on TV. But when people are not yet engaged, they tend to be more relaxed. So with things like their footwork and their handiwork, they tend to be a lot more sort of close together because it's relaxed. If I am raising my arms, or I'm getting ready for some sort of action, if I'm lunging to do something like a cut or thrust and close the distance a lot, then I'm a lot more spread out and different targets will expose themselves. If someone does something like a lunge, their hands, their forearms and their forward foot and leg tend to expose themselves a lot more, and what might not be quite as noticeable is that depending on how a person does a lunge, can, to a varying degree, expose their head. So if there's someone who is more experienced in footwork in fighting, they should, and something you should do, is when you do a lunge, you keep your torso and your head upright. So it looks something like this. So let's say I'm going to perform a lunge and a cut. So it'll look like that. So I'm staying fairly upright, I'm extending with my legs. And it means, apart from other factors which I'm not going to go into, such as the degree the weight is leaning so you can recover easily and start doing other footwork and stuff like that, one of the things that changes is the angles that are available to an opponent. So if I'm cutting like that, yes, I've gone a bit further forward. Clearly my arms and my legs have stretched out quite a bit forwards. But one of the things that people do when they're less experienced, especially in footwork, is they kind of go like that, and then they bend their back. They kind of, instead of doing something like using their legs and sort of their overall movement while staying upright, if they bend forward and lean like this, because of course, if you see now, it does, yes, give extra range. However, when a person, the attacker or a defender, is more upright, their head is less exposed. However, if they lean forwards, you'll notice that compared to where my arms can reach, like here, here's where my shoulder is, and you'll notice as I lean forward with my head, see where my hand is, this is level with the shoulder, and the head is actually presented slightly forward of the shoulder, whereas when I'm upright, the shoulder is slightly forward of the head. This is really important because if someone is not as experienced and they're doing that kind of lunge, your, I wouldn't say chances, I've mentioned this in previous videos, it sounds too much like a random numbers thing. This is really, you can or can't do something, there's no percentage. But anyway, rant aside, if you've got someone who's doing that, you have a significantly better opportunity to do a cut or thrust specifically at their head. Now, whether you're talking about some sort of fencing game with points, usually you score more numbers when you're hitting someone in the head compared to something like their torso. But additionally, in a more martially viable sense, it's better to perform cuts and thrusts towards the head because it's a more vulnerable part of the body, or disrupting their senses. If it was a real fight, it might have taken out something like an eye, or all kinds of reasons. So of course, someone being upright when they do a lunge, usually what I find is I prefer targeting areas like the arms and the legs. However, someone who is really bad at this, when this stuff starts happening, you find very many opportunities to cut the head. And the way in which it presents itself downwards as well, even if someone has their sword out ready to parry perhaps afterwards, or even has a shield, and they're not some idiot who pulls their shield away but actually engages with the shield. This is again a thing I'll go on about in a minute about angles. But if we look, let's say their shield is ready, if they're leaning their head forward, there's still an opportunity to drop down, especially if you are taller than the person who is lunging. You have more opportunities to fight down at their head. Now I've just mentioned about shields and presenting them. This is something I've talked about in other videos about basic sword and shield combat, but I'll go over it briefly again. When you're fighting with a shield, of course, yes, if you do something like this to block, you're stopping yourself from dying, you know. Here you can stab me in the chest, here you can't stab me in the chest, but it's something you should do even when you're attacking. So just as I'm going to talk in this video about finding and exploiting opportunities against someone to attack them, it should also be worth mentioning about your defense to close off those opportunities and stop that kind of thing from happening. So when we're looking at shields, or indeed a weapon on its own, or two weapons, you should try to close off an angle, not only passively, like when you're like this, you know, you're sort of relaxed and you're sort of, you know, getting ready and maybe someone goes in and attacks you. I mean, even when you are committing to something that can attack yourself. A lot of times when I'm looking at beginners who fight and they're using something like a shield, they do a lot of this. So, and you even see it in badly choreographed movie fights, frankly. A person will they'll do what's a good cutting mechanic. So if we looked at a target, like on a test cutting stand, that doesn't fight back, then yes, putting your dominant side forward and bringing your body to bear and then chopping right through, or stabbing powerfully, yes, this is the maximum amount of damage that you could do, to put it in a way, but it makes you very vulnerable. So if you have a shield or a second weapon, you know, something like a knife or another sword in your offhand, the worst thing you could do is take it away. So doing this, I can be cut in the hands, I can be cut in the upper arms, I can be cut around the head, torso, all sorts of places. And it means that while this beginner type of fighter is attacking and taking their shield away, it's almost as if they're not even holding their shield until they get back on the defensive, and it's almost like toggling a light switch. They're defensive and maybe not fighting back, and then they're on the offensive, and it's like they don't have a shield in the first place. This is bad fighting, because, again, of the opportunities and the angles that can be taken. So a good way to try and fight using a shield or second item, there are two main ways I find. Either the first one, a really simple one, that I call a sort of tight action, is you just put the two essentially together. So let's say I'm cutting at the head, instead of doing this, and my sword arm is completely exposed and the rest of my body, at the shield, I'm very covered. The attack is mostly the same. I don't find it affects the sort of potential for injury much, if at all, especially if you're doing thrusts. And of course, you're closing off the angles at which you can be attacked. If you look at me now, yes, there are possibilities I could get struck in the head, but slight adjustment, no you can't. This closes off many angles, and it makes it a lot more difficult to be struck while you're doing the attack. It's the best way to perform an attack, doing it in a way where you're covered at the same time. The second option is to simply have your shield or other item covering an angle while you attack somewhere else. So if I'm attacking low, I can cover high. If I'm attacking high, maybe I'm covering low. Maybe I can be covering one side while I'm cutting on the other. There are different ways to do it. I'm not going to dictate it to you because it's pretty simple stuff. But what's important is making sure that you're covering angles while exploiting some of your own. Now, if we take the shield out of the way for a minute, let's talk about that technique I was talking about earlier. So, with the technique that I'm referring to, I'm going to switch swords now. That was a Falcata Yataghan type of sword that I forged myself. This was one by Regenier, but with the broad blade and the crossguard, it will make it far easier for you, the audience, to see what is happening, because the angle at which I turn the sword is going to be very important for this next part. So, when a person is, engaging, whether they're on the offense or the defense, whether they're attacking or doing an active parry, one technique that I've been experimenting with, which again it goes into that thing I mentioned about going offline and using your footwork to, in a non-linear way, attack your opponent. So this is where it's a good time to mention about how footwork can affect your angles. Of course, there are the normal angles if we're engaging directly, face to face. However, if someone's stepping towards this direction, then these angles are open more. So of course, cutting around the sword arm, the shoulder, the dominant side, head, become more open. And then of course, the opposite for the other side. Simple stuff. But a way you can exploit that, as less obvious, is using, I haven't got a name for it yet, I will call it the unexpected hand carve. There we go. I've given it a name. Okay, so the unexpected hand carve. One of my key styles is attacking hands and forearms as they present themselves. It's a defensive method of fighting, and it means that while or after an opponent has attacked, or even sometimes just immediately without the opponent doing any attack, you cut at the hands and forearms, especially the dominant arm, that present themselves as they arrive. So a person could be perhaps in their stance, they arrive, cut, and with the hands and the forearms being further forward, you can hit them from further away. I can hit this area far easier than I can hit back to these sorts of areas. And as you can see, or as I'm showing now, the further forward the hands and forearms, the more of an obvious target they become. If they're level like this, it's not even worth it anymore, and you might as well target head and torso sort of areas. as they present themselves further forward, it's far more viable to attack them. Now there is a way in which stepping offline and performing a cut can be done very juicily. So what I do is, using my one-handed sword or two-handed sword, it really doesn't matter, it can work with pretty much any cutting weapon, probably even things like axes as well, is I step offline and then I deliberately cut around, and this is why you need to watch where this is carefully, because of course notice this is where the sword is directly forwards pointing towards you, and this is out to the side. So as I go offline, I do not just attack forwards directly. So if a person is trying to parry me in this sort of fashion or this sort of fashion, usually they're angling their body to defend against you going directly for them. So let's say I want to attack from my left, so like this, towards their sword arm. Let's assume the opponent is right-handed. I'll talk about left-handedness in a minute. So if I go like that, and the opponent goes like that, I get parried. The sword is stopped. Maybe I think perhaps I can go a bit further out, so I step offline, I try again. Maybe the opponent was just barely able to parry me last time, and now I've gone a bit further out. I can sneak around and cut back here around the forearm, the wrist, maybe the back, sort of knuckle area of the hand, these sorts of bits. But usually it's not enough, because it doesn't change it much. I'm cutting from this sort of angle instead of from here. It's mostly the same. However, if I change it so that I'm not cutting forwards and I'm cutting around to the side, this completely changes it. So I go for my opponent again. This sort of cut doesn't work. This sort of cut doesn't work. This sort of cut does work. So I've taken it to the extreme. So I'm extending my arm out. Of course it can be a vulnerable target if they see what's happening, hence it's a technique I'm going to use very rarely, and I've only ever used it once or twice in a match against someone. But what I'm doing is, of course, as I step offline, I've got my body slightly further out, so they're expecting me here. I'm slightly further out, so it's easier to cut behind their defense at their arm. But then if I extend my hand out, and then I'm almost moving it like a windscreen wiper like this, and this is just, it's kind of a bit like a German crump, I think it's called, or one of those. I can't remember, I don't do German stuff much, but there's a defense that works kind of like that, which works usually with two-handed swords, but it's a type of defense. But that same motion where you're using the wrists, I extend my arm out, cut. So what's happening is, if a person's expecting me attacking forwards, like I said, this gets parried. You can see the angle at which my sword is coming. If I step out, there's this angle, which is slightly further out and going around where their defense is. And then there's the most extreme version, where I'm going from completely outside of where they are originally defending from. This I use most frequently against the hands and forearms, because by the time you start extending yourself out like that, I find that if I try to use it against deeper targets such as the shoulder or the head, it's already getting so close that they're trying something and it ends up in a sort of a double hit. So I'm exploiting that angle to hit at the head, and they might just do a basic strike to hit me in the head or somewhere else instead. It's not a very good method of fighting to be hit whilst you hit, of course. So hence, I use it against the outside targets like the hand and forearm, especially in things like military sabre, I noticed, because one of the main ways to fight is having your arms extended. So there's this sort of hanging guard, outside guard, inside guard. So you notice in these postures and positions, they naturally start with the hands and forearms forward. If the person was more kind of relaxed like here in a sort of a Fiore's long tail, it no longer becomes viable. But like I said, there are many instances where opponents have their hands and forearms forward, especially when actively performing cuts and thrusts. So it's quite a useful way if you're dodging someone and then riposte at them afterwards, especially if they kind of have a defensive method of fighting. This can work against someone who is opposite-handed to you. So in my case, I'm going to stay right-handed, and we'll say the opponent is left-handed. So in this case, rather than going out like that, I'm going out like that. So it's basically the same kind of motion. I'm being careful not to swing and hit the TV just out of frame here, but cutting from the outside in, and then, like I said, I'm going out, which is further away from where they were defending, and then exploiting the angles to cut in at them. So that's one way of exploiting angles in a fairly extreme fashion. So yeah, that's that. I suppose I should finish this off by talking a bit more about the angles you get when you are stepping offline. So it should be noted that you can continue in these sort of fashions, and something that's less of a technique that I've invented and more just common fencing is that you can perform some sort of defense or even just close in very aggressively to bind and then go around your opponent. So a very simple way is an aggressive and fast opponent, or in your case your own self, can close distance, perhaps offering some defense or threat, and then go around behind the opponent, and then usually they're not quite so fast that they can be completely behind the person and strike them in the back like something out of Dark Souls, but it is more like the sort of thing where you can go around and you're hitting them somewhat behind. I find when this happens to me, I get hit usually around the shoulder blade or the back of the head, which is one of the reasons why I have a back of head protector when I'm sparring, just in case of such things. And this can be done, of course, left, it can be done right. It can also be done somewhat forwards. This can mean that you end up engaging with them, so you end up in a grappling range more. But, of course, if you're not going at a diagonal angle, there's a shorter distance to cover before you're behind them. The main thing is, when people charge in to close distance, there's the clear threat that while they're charging in, someone might just hit them on the way in. Because doing all of that stuff and going around and hitting from behind requires a lot more initiative than just, oh, he's running towards me, bang, cut them. So, of course, it's not like it's the most impossible thing. It's usually, like I said, you either have to do some sort of initial attack to gain that advantage, or do a covered entry. So this could work quite well with something like a shield, or if you're very good at parrying. Like, for example, when I'm up against taller opponents, because I'm only 5'7" tall, I find that a guard of St. George like this comes in handy when trying that sort of thing. Because with opponents being very tall, they are usually bearing down on me. So, apart from deliberate upwards cuts, these sorts of things, cutting from below upwards, or cutting right across to my legs or something, even if they're trying to cut at somewhere like the legs, going downwards from above, if you have some sort of cover like this, it can intercept it, especially since they're not really expecting you to charge in. So if an opponent tries to cut, this is another form of closing off the angles. If I'm in a normal position and the opponent cuts at my legs, they might succeed, especially since tall people tend to have very long arms. So I could be somewhat out of reach and I can't hit them, but then they just go chop and catch me. Because they're cutting down, however, and like I said, they're coming from above me, I can still raise for a defense as if I'm covering these high targets, but yet because they're bearing down on me towards my legs, a lower target, this sort of defense still works. So it's not always bad being a taller or shorter opponent. Like I said, it changes the angles, and you can use that. So I'm parrying with a guard of St. George or something high defense. They try to do some sort of cut, I parry, and now I'm going past them, and I can riposte in the way that I see fit. That's my preferred way because I'm more of a defensive fighter, so I'd prefer a covered entry where I'm stopping things from happening and then afterwards exploit the angles that open up, like someone goes, "Ugh!" chops down. Okay, all of this is opened up, cut. But someone who's more aggressive, if that's your preferred style, you could, for example, close in with a thrust, and then you should be really good at bind work, ideally. I've already done other videos discussing binds with swords, and other people have talked about it too. But if you're doing something like a thrust, of course you need to watch out that someone doesn't just try to cut or do some attack into it, in which case you stab them, they hit you, sort of horrible situation which happens way too often. But if you can catch someone, especially defensive person, on their sword and trying to thrust them, either, of course, you thrust at them, in which case you don't even need to run past them, fantastic, you've hit them on the entry, or if they've parried you on the way in, well, you're closing in and you can get behind them and carry on, just like I've mentioned earlier. So with that sort of style, it can still work. Just bear in mind what the opponent's trying to do. So if a person just attacks into an attack, charging at them in an aggressive fashion is a bad idea. In fact, I would posit that you should take the opposite style to the opponent when you're trying to do this. So if I'm against a very aggressive opponent, I would try to be defensive. So I find there are some people, the moment you get into range, their initial thought is hit. That's it. So I close into range, they think hit. No. You stop that hit. Probably coming from, like I said, if you're shorter, coming from above, maybe if we're going offline, then it'll be coming from that area that you just came from, those sorts of things. Cover that angle, close around, and then you've got all sorts of targets to exploit. If your opponent is very defensive, then you're kind of blocking at a load of nothing that's happening, and then if you've already tried to block, and this is something that applies outside of this particular charging in, if you're trying to defend something that didn't happen, you give new angles. So let's say this is how a feint can work, incidentally. So someone's there, this will work better with my quicker sword. So someone tries simple feint, and then I go, oh no! And look at that, I've just presented a new target. So you just go, chop! So they've got not really any particular targets unless they close in. They try a feint. Oh no! I tried to defend the thing that didn't happen. They take out the new target. It's a very easy and simple way of fencing. That's why in movies and in real life, feints are a fairly common tactic. It's just good stuff. I've talked more about the tactics and ways in which feints can be used very well in other times, but still, it's a simple enough concept. You pretend somewhere, they react to whatever's happening, either attacking into your attack or trying to defend that pretend attack, and new angles open up. So if I parry like this, you'll notice, yes, I've covered my head, but if I don't have a basket hilt, like on a sabre, I actually once did this against someone. This is going more from real life experience, not just hypotheticals. To put it into something that actually happened to me personally, I was fencing against someone with military sabre, and he was, doing the usual kind of military sabre style, arms forward, doing all of this. And one of the ways in which you parry in British military sabre is this, Guard of St. George I mentioned earlier. So what I did was I was, feinting around, just trying to see if I could attack him. I attack, he parries, I feint, he reacts, all of this is going on, and then he did a Guard of St. George, well, an attack that I wasn't doing. So I wasn't being intercepted, I was free and open to do what I want. So what happened? He went up like this, into a Guard of St. George. If I bared down on his head, of course, parry, riposte, I would die. What actually happened is he prematurely tried this defense, and then I went, chop! And I cut here into his hand. And it just so happens that he really didn't have sufficient protection, despite the fact that we were using full weight steel sabres. So another part of that which buries itself in my mind is that he ended up with quite a lump on his hand. His three knuckles turned into one because he had a big lump going across there. But point being, he prematurely defended against an attack I wasn't doing, and then it gave me a new angle. Even though he's got a basket hilt protecting his hand, he's got it raised up. So if I'm going chop down, maybe his sword defends it. If I go chop directly down, his basket hilt would still keep his hand safe, but I did not. I went forwards, so instead of being caught on this bridge, I just went into the hand itself. And I think the reason why he got caught on the knuckle is because his hand was kind of a bit further around his sword, but regardless, it went inside where the basket hilt was and caught his hand, because that was a new angle that opened itself. Normally, if someone's doing those sorts of parries, having a basket hilt means you can't hit someone's hands. But as the hand carver, I noticed that with that sword up, I could cut not from above downwards, like it's a video game proper slinging your arms about kind of chop, but more like punching forwards or casting a fishing rod out. I put the sword forwards very directly from A, where I was, to B, where he was, and that meant that with that specific angle, instead of being parried, I struck. So that's something to bear in mind. Cutting from higher or lower or different sides can significantly help with your fighting. It's also noteworthy with armour as well. So if someone is wearing a full suit of armour, usually they have weaker armour in areas like inside the cuff of the gauntlet, palm of the hand, elbows, inside of the armpits, those sorts of things. So you have to exploit the angles more. But there are still ways in which, depending on how an opponent is coming towards you or reacting to you, there are ways in which you can then exploit it. So yes, that's a little bit of stuff to think about with regards to cutting at your opponents and thrusting. I did focus on cutting mostly and didn't talk as much about thrusting because cutting is 95+% of what I do anyway, so more experience. But the same principles still apply even with thrusts. So hopefully you found that useful, and I shall see you later. Ta-ra for now.